teaching us about great power and great responsibility for over 60 years. Today we're talking about the one, the only, the amazing Spider-Man. And today I'll be sharing my favorite choices for the best places to start reading about this spectacular character. Greetings everyone, my name is Dominic and you're tuning in to The Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today we're going to be taking a look at some of my favorite places to start reading Spider-Man. But hey, if you're new to my channel, go ahead and consider hitting that subscribe button. Also, I love to hear from you all, so please feel free to leave a comment on your way out. Now let's go ahead and get started with that list. Okay, first up on my list of where to start reading Spider-Man, was there any doubt? You have to start with Amazing Fantasy 15. This first appearance of Spider-Man dropped in 1962, and frankly, it still holds up to this day. After this issue of Amazing Fantasy, Spider-Man gets his own title with, you guessed it, The Amazing Spider-Man. This early Silver Age run, brought to us by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, is for my money the star of the entire Silver Age of comics. This alongside the Fantastic Four, at least in my opinion. And I'm thankful to own a lot of Spider-Man's early adventures in this Amazing Spider-Man Omnibus Volume 1. You can find a lot of Spider-Man's early adventures in omnibus format, Epic Collections, Mighty Marvel Masterworks, the Marvel Essential line, digital, and of course the single issues. Some might be out of print or at varying stages of scarcity, but if you have the opportunity within your budget to check out this early Stan Lee, Steve Ditko run on Spider-Man, I highly recommend it. For our purposes today, I'm going to be flipping lightly through the Omnibus collection here. Throughout this video, I'm also going to be flipping through the different collections I have, showcasing some of these runs, so you can get an idea of maybe what you can expect, some of the art, and what some of these editions look like, so that if you want to jump in and read Spider-Man for yourselves, you can kind of get a better picture of what you're jumping in for. And for you longtime webheads, well, you never know, maybe there's something on my list you haven't gotten to yet. And if you see something that's not in this list that you would definitely add, let me know in the comments below. I'm always looking for new great Spider-Man stories I haven't read. Going back to this collection itself, to answer the question, why is this a great place for new readers? Well, in this case, it should be self-explanatory. This is the beginnings of the character. This is the origin, the first appearances of many of his noteworthy villains, supporting characters, and some of the broader themes that you see throughout most of his history. And even though some of this book seems quite dated as far as the panel layouts, the degree of exposition and bubble dialogue boxes, and just maybe some of the overall things that happen in the issues themselves, it's still entirely readable and then some. As I mentioned, this is the star of the Silver Age for me. And I believe one of the things that made Peter Parker Spider-Man such a standout from moment one is, unlike a lot of the other contemporary superheroes of the time, Spider-Man was quite a bit younger, but holding his own title all his own as a teenager. I think another thing that made this such a standout, especially for its time, is, I'm just going to call it that old Parker luck. Stan Lee really made Peter Parker a sympathetic character in that not a whole lot went right for him. You know, he didn't have his parents. He was raised by his aunt and uncle. His uncle tragically dies in a way that Peter Parker feels like he could have prevented, instilling in him the great lesson, with great power comes great responsibility. Peter Parker is also a character that, for the most part of his history, he's kind of down on his luck. Things sometimes go poorly for him. When he gets newspaper attention, he's portrayed as a menace. There are times his jobs fall through, his relationships fall through. He's plagued with a lot of personal doubt, and frankly, all of these factors make him intensely relatable. Here you have this high-flying, super-powered individual who has a lot of personal problems that many of the readership could relate to in some ways. This is quite a bit different than what we had seen in the other contemporary superhero books of the time. In these early issues, it's not long before we're introduced to some of the most iconic comic book villains of all time. Green Goblin, Doc Ock, Electro, the Vulture, Mysterio, the Rhino, Scorpion, and many, many more. It is outstanding to see how many of his popular villains showed up in some of the first issues of his initial series. I believe something that also makes Spider-Man such a great character is his villains. The quips and interplay between a lot of his villains and himself, how he navigates those conflicts, and generally just how great the characters were really elevate this series. For my money, when I think of villains, it's really just Batman and Spider-Man at the tippy top for their selection of the best supervillains of all time. And to see so many of these incredible characters within the first few issues of the initial run from Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, there's a reason that this comic has lasted so long. Another thing that this run of Spider-Man gets right, that I think a lot of the best Spider-Man runs also do, is that the best runs also have a slice of life quality to them with the exploits of Peter Parker. It's not only Spider-Man in the mask that I care about when I read a good Spider-Man title, it's also what's going on in his personal life that he's juggling along with all of his adventures as the Amazing Spider-Man. And in this early run, we get to see how he handles high school bullies, crushes, early job opportunities, his dynamic at home with his Aunt May. And while that may seem humdrum to some, it really helps ground the character. And it wasn't uncommon for me to get so wrapped up in his personal life that the superheroics were more of the cherry on top. That being said, there were still plenty of times where the Spider-Man aspects of this comic were absolutely the selling point. But really those factors together are what make this book, well, so amazing. A word of advice for those comic fans or prospective comic fans out there that only read modern comics, go back, read the first 5-10 issues of The Amazing Spider-Man, and just learn where this character got its start. You might be surprised at how relevant a book like this can still feel. And truthfully, there are far worse reads out there than The Amazing Spider-Man by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And now let's go to our next recommendation. Stop number 2 on where to start reading Spider-Man, and that of course brings us to the definitive run from the 1980s. Of course I'm talking about Roger Stern's Spider-Man. Like a good handful of collections on my list today, I have an omnibus. This is the Roger Stern Spider-Man omnibus, and it collects the entirety of his run on both titles he worked on at the time, that being Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, and the Amazing Spider-Man. And as you can probably tell, this is one colossal book that truthfully I'm still making my way through. But already with what I've read, it has to have a spot on this list on where to start reading Spider-Man. As I previously mentioned, this is the 1980s Spider-Man, and one aspect of this run that I've really enjoyed so far is I feel like Roger Stern invites in newer, lesser-known supervillains for Spider-Man to grapple with that, for me, having not read many appearances by some of these characters, one that screams to mind is Belladonna. She shows up in a few issues that I've read already. Will-O-Wisp, Jack-O-Lantern. There's some of these second or tertiary tier Spider-Man villains, but they're so refreshing because I haven't read many appearances by these supervillains. I know sometimes for me, if everything I read with Spider-Man is him battling some kind of goblin or Doc Ock or, some of the mainstays, eventually I will get a little tired of just the same battles and the same characters over and over again. So one thing I loved about this run, from what I've read so far, is an introduction and fights with a lot lesser known supervillains. That being said, he ultimately does bring in, again, some of those mainstays and people you obviously know from his rogues gallery. The Vulture screams to mind. He uses him quite a bit in this run. This run is also very notable for introducing the Hobgoblin, which is an incredible character in Spider-Man's history and certainly fascinating as far as the mystery of who this character is. I think touching back on something I mentioned about the Stan Lee Steve Ditko run that is absolutely prevalent in the Roger Stern run as well is that slice of life quality. At this point, we're at a different season in Peter Parker's life. He's sort of a college student trying to figure out work, trying to figure out relationships. He has some things dabbling with Mary Jane Watson at this point, but also has little trysts and situations with Black Cat There's a level 2 of him kind of flirting with these other women, and will they, won't they, and what's going on in his romantic life. And overall, the title feels a bit older. He's a character who now is somewhere in his mid-20s, I would guess. He's out of high school by quite a bit, and you feel like he's in the next seasons of his life. He's growing up. And I think that's an aspect I really love about good Spider-Man runs as well, is when you read a lot of them, you can kind of see the passage of time, even in a medium where years kind of blend together because these continuities in comics have run for over 60 years. But frankly, it's refreshing to read. And I think that this is a great place to start reading Spider-Man because it's at the beginning of a very long run and a very great point in Spider-Man's history. This is a beloved run, and there's so much character development here, great conflict here, and it's just a very cool snapshot into the life of such an incredible character. Another interesting thing about Roger Stern's run on Spider-Man is that he crosses across both of the active Spider-Man titles of the time. And I think the general consensus is that the momentum and pacing in the Peter Parker Spectacular Spider-Man run was not as intense as what happens when Roger Stern jumps over onto the Amazing Spider-Man title. There's a sense of building, a sense of tension that grows as the run progresses, culminating in a lot of the great Hobgoblin stuff. And honestly, as you make your way through, you feel that. You feel like you're actually building up to something. And that's really fun in a character run like this. I think one of the reasons as well, I think this is a great place to start reading Spider-Man, is that in my mind, this is a quintessential Spider-Man experience. You have all the elements that you need to really feel like you know the characters of Peter Parker's Spider-Man. I think if someone was a blank slate as far as Spider-Man knowledge went, if they went in, read this, I feel like they could go in, not be alienated, not feel like they've missed 20, 30 years of history, and still feel like they can jump in, easily access it, and walk away feeling like they have a really great grasp of this character, his world, some of his rogues gallery, but also most of his supporting cast relationships. Aunt May, Mary Jane, like his friends, his education and vocational interests, at least at this time. Just a great, well-rounded collection that you could, again, feel like you could take a big bite out of with very low barrier to entry, walk away feeling like you've had a definitive Spider-Man experience. Another just general fascinating thing about reading Spider-Man is because this character has been around for over 60 years, and this character has been so popular and has had many different people write and illustrate him, and also the fact that he's situated often with journalistic stuff happening around him. You know, a lot of his history, he's a photographer for the Daily Bugle or different newspaper organizations. I think because of that, there's this level that there's a lot of social, political commentary of like where the world was at different periods, civil rights, social justice issues, that make it feel very time-stamped. Even going from Stan Lee, Steve Ditko's run in the 60s to this one in the 80s, you can just tell like the general temperature of society as a whole. And so you get this also really cool time capsule feel as you go through some of these runs of Spider-Man. There's a lot more I could say about this run of Spider-Man, and probably more I will say when I finally personally completed this entire omnibus. But until then, I still think it's a good recommendation, but it's on to our next one. Okay, for stop number 3 on where to read Spider-Man, I'm going to call this the greater Todd McFarlane era of Spider-Man. So this third choice is actually maybe technically choice 3 and 4. I'll be looking at both the David Michelinie Todd McFarlane Spider-Man run, as well as just the Todd McFarlane adjectiveless Spider-Man run. I have both omnibuses here that encapsulate this period. This is some of the greater 90s Spider-Mans. There are more than just this. There are different creators that come onto these books throughout different points in the 90s, but this is really a benchmark cornerstone of 90s Spider-Man. And I have a couple reasons why I think that these should maybe be on your list of where to start reading Spider-Man. So we're going to go ahead and start with the David Michelinie, Todd McFarlane Amazing Spider-Man run. This is the Amazing Spider-Man Omnibus by those creators. I've done, I think, an unboxing for this on my channel. I've unboxed or reviewed quite a few of the books that you'll see in today's review. I'll try to link them at different points so you can go ahead and watch those for further watching if you'd like. You can see me kind of delving a little bit deeper deeper into some of these individual books. But for today's purposes, again, we'll be looking first at the David Michelinie, Todd McFarlane run. So this run collects all of David Michelinie and Todd McFarlane's run on this book, but it actually starts with a couple issues that are just David Michelinie with an other artist. Actually, I think maybe just one or two before Todd McFarlane jumps on the book. What's really interesting artistically about this book as well is you can see Todd McFarlane almost get more creative control over the art for it. You can see him, I think, take over inkings at one point, and it really feels more like his style. The first handful of issues from him, I know at least, aren't him inking it, and it's so profoundly interesting to see how much good inker or different inkers play on the illustrations and pencil works themselves, because when Todd McFarlane has the pencil work and the inking work, it really screams McFarlane. And you can see that evolution throughout this collection, and certainly as we crest into just the Todd McFarlane omnibus next. But what makes this a great place to start reading Spider-Man? I'm so glad you asked. If you're a 90s kid like me, this is maybe your Spider-Man. This is maybe your definitive Spider-Man experience. And I certainly think it's a unique chapter in his life. In this title, Peter and Mary Jane are recently married, so again, we're into another stage of Peter Parker's life as he transitions into having his own household unit with him and his bride. We also have him starting this run in the cloth black Spider-Man suit. This is after he's rid himself of the symbiote costume he acquired during the Secret Wars situation, but throughout this book, you actually see him back in his red and blue, the classic iconic Spider-Man gear, and that, of course, is because this is the run that introduces us to Venom, where that symbiote grafts itself onto Eddie Brock, where both parties hate Spider-Man / Peter Parker, and of course become one of his greatest nemesis? I'm not really sure how to say that. So this is a great run. I think that a lot of people know this run primarily as being one, Todd McFarlane art, and two, the introduction to Venom. I think that this is a great place to start reading because Venom is a powerhouse villain character in the Spider-Man universe, as well as an anti-hero. Clearly, he's becoming more and more culturally prevalent as well with his own movies, things like that. So I would say this is a great place not just for Spider-Man to start reading, but also Venom. This is some of his earliest appearances, and it's pretty outstanding. Another reason why I think this is a great place to start reading Spider-Man is that we're starting to enter into more experimental forms of art as far as the panel layout. Again, we'll see a lot more of this as we transition to the Todd McFarlane omnibus next, but you can already see the artistic kind of creative direction of these books changing and doing something new. We see a kind of excitement and just creativity in the layouts of these books that made the reading experience quite a bit more unique. There's also kind of a cartoonish yet detailed, realistic aspect of McFarlane's work that I've always really appreciated, and you see that here. It screams 90s art in the best way possible. To me, McFarlane is the pinnacle of 90s artists, and I love reading this Spider-Man work. And honestly, Dave Michelinie, his writing is pretty top-notch. We get to see a lot of pretty intensive character conflicts, early marriage conflicts that really help just connect with these characters, and of course make you connect overall with the books and the themes and the stories that are told across this omnibus. This is truly a classic Spider-Man era that I think many Spider-Man fans would feel shortchanged if they never experienced. And I also think there's a low enough barrier to entry on this as well that you won't be too confused if this is the first Spider-Man you're exposed to. In my mind, these creators really balance well a kind of grittiness and playfulness with this era of Spider-Man. There's some dark lows and some high, mirth-filled highs, and sometimes everything in between. You balance the horrors of Venom and some of the devastating consequences and conflicts there with the joys of new marriage and the conflicts of new marriage. And I think that overall, it's a great title not to sleep on. And now, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and transition to part 2 of this Todd McFarlane era. Now that we're finishing up that David Michelinie, Todd McFarlane era on Amazing Spider-Man, we're going to jump into the adjectiveless Spider-Man omnibus. So this is the title, Spider-Man. There's no amazing, no spectacular, no web of. It's just Spider-Man. And this series kicks off with Todd McFarlane himself as writer, penciler, and inker. That's right, it's all Todd all the time with this omnibus, for good or for ill, and we'll get into that in a second. As you can see, this is not a huge book, but because of that, you can sometimes find this for a bit cheaper, at least at the time of the recording. So why I think that this is a good feature in this video is that this is still pinnacle 90s Spider-Man, particularly as it pertains to the artwork. I think that there is so much experimentation that happens in this collection for Spider-Man. It also includes one of the best-selling comic books of all time, that of course being Spider-Man #1 here. Iconic cover, so much to love here. But again, why I think this is a great choice, I think that this is really fun for horror fans. If you like the light horror genre or kind of suspense, supernatural, thriller aspects, especially in your comics, but generally in your storytelling, this is Spider-Man with kind of a horror twist. You have like 3 or 4 little arcs throughout this book. One that has to do with sort of this weird huntress witch chick and the lizard. Another one that has to do with Wendigo and Wolverine. Another one that has to do with sort of underground vampires. I'll let you kind of see more for that for yourself, and so on. This is a really good book because you can see some of the greatest experimentation with artwork I have ever read in comics. And like I said, this came out in the 90s, and now, 30 years later, I sometimes don't even see comics today as experimental artistically as Todd McFarlane was in this book. Forget panel layouts. This guy is doing whatever he wants to do to convey a sense of scope and story and really just kind of artistic design work. The aesthetic for this book is absolutely jaw-droppingly beautiful and frankly the main draw for this collection. That artwork is stellar and stunning. The webs are ornate and everywhere. The villains are gruesome and horrifying looking, and honestly, Spider-Man has maybe never looked cooler than in some of the panels that he does here. But other than the horror aspects, unfortunately the writing is not quite as strong. But hey, still worth checking out. While not the strongest entry on this list, I'm still happy I included it, especially for horror fans out there. And now that we're ending the Todd McFarlane era, let's go ahead and get going to our next pick. The next stop on our Where to Start Reading Spider-Man list is, of course, the great J. Michael Straczynski run on Spider-Man. Today we'll be flipping through The Amazing Spider-Man by J. Michael Straczynski, Omnibus Volume 1. His entire run is collected across 2 omnibus volumes. Like I said, we'll be looking at Volume 1 today. You can also find them in Ultimate collections, possibly some older trade paperbacks, floppies, digital, things of that ilk. Now, people that might be a little out of the know for this era of Spider-Man, J. Michael Straczynski's run is a tad polarizing in some ways. I feel like those that have read the entire run really give the credit where credit's due, because this is a fantastic run on Spider-Man and a great part of his history. That being said, there are maybe 2 notorious story arcs that you can find within J. Michael Straczynski's run on Spider-Man that I think are a little rough. I think the stories themselves read really great. They're just rough in the ways that they retcon the continuity or kind of make choices about the characters and their lives that longtime Spider-Man fans maybe disapprove of. And the first arc you get at the end of this collection, and the other arc you get, I believe, at the end of Omnibus Volume 2. It has to do with Mary Jane and Peter Parker's marriage and the post-Civil War era Spider-Man. For Volume 1, it's an arc called Sin's Past that has to do with the legacy of Gwen Stacy. And I'll try not to speak on that too much. You might get a peek of it here. But wow, there's a lot I could say about that arc. But we're just going to go ahead and move forward, and I'm going to choose to focus on why I think this is a great start for new readers and why I think it's a fantastic run overall. Like some of the others on this list, I think that this is a fantastic run because this is really a specific era in Spider-Man's history. This is kind of early to mid 2000s, and like so many long runs in Spider-Man's history, when you start at the beginning of the run, you're at a perfect entry point for new readers. It is absolutely accessible. You can jump in without knowing much of anything about the character and be up to speed in no time. The readability on this book is incredible. It kind of creates a new status quo for the character. Like I said, J. Michael Straczynski does quite a bit of retcons throughout his run. One of the most notable in this is has to do with his origin on, did the spider bite him because it was radioactive, or was the spider already on its way to bite him and then it got irradiated? It kind of makes Peter Parker sort of this chosen Spider-Man totem or figure to have these spider powers. We're introduced to a lot of other spider-powered people throughout this run, along with just some fantastic other story arcs. This run as well, I really love the character interactions, particularly between Peter Parker and Mary Jane. They're still happily married at the beginning of this run, and I just love to see the dynamic develop. Another thing I really like, you kind of have a vocational change for Peter Parker. There's stints in this run where he actually becomes kind of a high school science teacher, and I think that really is a kind of a fulfillment of some of his character attributes and character arcs from early on. He's always been a great lover of science and education, and to have him as a teacher who gets to pour out and invest in these younger students' lives, as he's able to kind of help out some more underprivileged or downtrodden students that he, of course, relates to, kind of knowing a lot of his teenage background. It's really a kind of full circle season in this comic. You get to see through how he teaches these high schoolers. You kind of get a reflection on some of his early stuff since this title started when he was himself a teenager in high school, and I love to see that. I don't think it has been explored as well before or since, and I love that aspect about this book. Like I said, this book really sets up a new status quo for the hero, so I think it's a great place to go ahead and start. And the art is dynamic but beautiful, highly detailed. Particularly the art at the beginning of the collection is quite a bit more cartoony than maybe some like, but I still think it's just fresh, bright, and quite beautiful. I feel like it's easy to do a book where Spider-Man looks heroic, but it's something else entirely when Peter Parker looks heroic. And I think that this book gives a lot back to the character of Peter, and I love to see that as a longtime Spider-Man fan. And I think for newcomers to the books, it's a great way to get more grounded and more invested in this primary character for the Spider-Man titles. And I think for those that have never given J. Michael Straczynski's run a shot, perhaps because you've heard of some of those story arcs I mentioned that are kind of taboo or people don't like, you're really missing some great stuff here. I think it's really easy to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. Oh man, what a horrible expression. But you know what I mean? It's kind of like you miss the good trying to get rid of some of the little things that maybe aren't perfect. And I think that a lot of people do that on this run. I think luckily the general consensus overall is that this is an incredible run on Spider-Man. But again, I have to just give even more credit. This is an absolutely amazing run on Spider-Man. Another pro to this collection, unlike some previous on my list, I think this is the first one I've recommended that feels decidedly more modern and not as dated. Sure, it's now already almost 20 years old itself, but it still feels like a very modern comic run, at least to me. So for those of you watching that maybe only prefer modern era comics, I think that this might be your true starting point for Spider-Man. And now that we've reached the end of this omnibus, we're going to go ahead and get ready for the next pick for where to start reading Spider-Man. Next up, would any where to start reading Spider-Man list be complete without Brian Michael Bendis's and Mark Bagley's The Ultimate Spider-Man? Of course the answer is no, because this is a great definitive place to start reading the character. A couple things to note about The Ultimate Spider-Man. When this title first started in 2000, this is its own side universe. So this isn't the primary Marvel 616 universe. This is a totally separate universe, Spider-Man. This is the universe where Miles Morales eventually gets his start at the end of Peter Parker's tenure as Ultimate Spider-Man. This whole span, I think, went for over a decade, and it's an incredible book. This is, to me, some of Brian Michael Bendis' best work, alongside his Daredevil run, which I also absolutely adore. These are also some of my favorite pencils I've ever seen from Mark Bagley, who was a very prolific 90s Spider-Man artist before he went ahead and started doing Ultimate Spider-Man as well here in the 2000s. I know he also did Spider-Man Life Story, amongst so many other works. Love his stuff. So, like I said, The Ultimate Spider-Man takes place in an alternate universe. This is a fully contemporized, as of 2000, reboot, relaunch of Spider-Man. So we see a decidedly younger Peter Parker Spider-Man. He's back in high school, dealing with high schooler things. Now in the 2000s rather than the 60s. And so that's really refreshing in a lot of ways. I think another thing that's really fun is you get to see a lot of those early villain interactions for the very first time, sometimes with a fun remix or refreshment. Some of the characters and villains are twisted or changed or altered from their 616 counterparts. And some in very refreshing ways, some in very shocking or unusual ways, and ultimately it leads to a very gratifying reading experience for both longtime fans of Spider-Man and brand new fans alike. Because this is the very beginning in an alternate universe, there is no background required. You could literally have never heard of Spider-Man before at all, even culturally. Pick up issue 1 and you're off to the races. This is like reading Stan Lee or Steve Ditko's run, where it's just blank canvas from this point. And wow, what a great way to reach new readers. And I think that for those maybe longtime Spider-Man fans who might be watching this video who have never wanted to give Ultimate Spider-Man a shot, I implore you, give it a chance. It might be a little too hip or young, which is funny now because it's even over 20 years old itself, but it might be a little too fresh for sometimes older readers or people that are really holding on to only 616 Peter Parker, and I totally respect that opinion, but I think that there is so much to love about this collection, and it really helps you, you can almost juxtapose the 616 early Spider-Man stuff with this, and sometimes the differences between them are even more pronounced, and it makes me care about both runs individually even more. This thing really underscored things I loved about Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's run, and vice versa. Like reading both and then reading this, it also showed me things I really love decidedly about the Ultimate Spider-Man relaunch as well. I think it's such a unique title and one that should absolutely be explored. High points for me about this run are, I feel like it's more emotionally grounded. I'm way more invested in this Peter Parker than maybe even the early 60s Peter Parker when it first started. I do think it plays up some of the teenage drama and general soap opera nature of some of those romantic and relational conflicts. So for those out there that can't abide any kind of teenage drama, this might be a little bit of a harder sell, but please try to stick to it if my recommendation means anything, because there's so much more to this title than that. And for all the kind of stuff that plays to teenage demographics, I do think it's still absolutely gripping. And not for nothing, those things still work. I'm still emotionally invested in all of these characters, particularly the kind of first love, young love of Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson that we get to see in this book. I also think how they remix or like respin the Gwen Stacy character to be kind of more of a tough as nails, hard on her luck girl was definitely kind of a fun shift from her kind of squeaky clean image in the original run of Spider-Man. Also, all the stuff they do with Eddie Brock and the Venom symbiote in this, it becomes kind of a man-eating alien rather than that costume, which also, ate men. I don't know. All I have to say is how they refresh Venom. It feels more monstrous and alien than in the 616 universe, at least when it was first introduced in the 90s. I really appreciated that. As well as I think a lot of the updates were really smart. Having Oscorp be kind of a central hub by which a lot of these kind of super-powered events or villain creations happened, I think was really fun. I think we see a lot of the evidence of the Ultimate Spider-Man in things like the Amazing Spider-Man film franchise, as well as the MCU Spider-Man, the kind of younger, more teen-heavy Spider-Man. I think Ultimate Spider-Man was absolutely an influence on those film properties for fans of those. But yeah, absolutely marvelous. I also just love Bagley's art throughout this. It's young, it's refreshing, and honestly, it looks different than his 90s work he did on the Amazing Spider-Man title. And it's just funny. I don't know if it's because it's computer assisted or what, but it looks different. I can still tell it's Bagley, but it's Bagley that just pops even more. This is some of my favorite of his art that I've seen. I did mention that in Spider-Man Life Story, I feel like it might even be more elevated than this. But overall, he's just firing on all cylinders. Bendis, this is, again, one of my favorites he's written, and it's just a fantastic way to start reading Spider-Man, as long as you're okay with it not being the 616 universe. And this is the last of our omnibuses we'll be looking at today. The rest are going to be standard-size hardcovers or trade paperback. And again, at this point, if there's anything on my list that you like, let me know about it in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. And with that, we're going to go ahead and continue on with our Where to Start Spider-Man list. Wow, I just love this book. Okay, and my next recommendation on where to start reading Spider-Man is the very beginning of the Dan Slott era of Spider-Man. Of course, I'm talking about Spider-Man Brand New Day. Okay, and here's a look at that collection. This is a standard size hardcover. This is just a little 5 or 6 issue collection containing the beginning of the Brand New Day story arc. This was, again, another resetting of the status quo. This Dan Slott era takes place directly after J. Michael Straczynski's era, which I talked about earlier. The culmination of that run, post-Civil War, Spider-Man was like an outlaw vigilante. He's no longer married. His life is kind of back in shambles, and he basically stops being Spider-Man for a little bit or goes underground a bit. So this takes place directly after that, his Brand New Day, new status quo. That also kind of reset the norms. You know, he's back in like squalor, you know, like really horrible living conditions, and maybe or maybe not selling pictures to the Daily Bugle. And again, it's kind of a resetting of a lot of earlier down on his luck, Parker luck kind of Spider-Man. Why I recommend this to beginners is because, again, it's a great jumping on point when everything is kind of softly reset. It is catering itself to brand new readers who want to get in on the ground floor of a new era of Spider-Man. I know Dan Slott, I believe, wrote for Amazing Spider-Man for over 10 years, I think. I've read bits and pieces of the run myself. He just did it for so long. I'm always excited to read more of it. Personally, I really like a lot of Dan Slott's Spider-Man. I know that there's been some kind of polarizing views on that, or a lot of people that just want to see him right back away with Mary Jane again after JMS's run. So I get why people kind of hate on it, but everything I've read of Slott's run so far, I have thoroughly enjoyed. I mean, there's a reason he wrote for so long on Spider-Man. This also gives a lot more agency to Aunt May. She works at kind of a homeless shelter, like soup kitchen kind of situation, and is busying herself with kind of bettering people's lives and being more of a pillar in her community. I thought that was a really nice touch for a really important supporting character in Spider-Man's life. It also introduces some new villains. This volume alone brings forth Mr. Negative, and I think Malice is the name of the goblin figure. Really like that. There's a new like vigilante hero friend of Spider-Man's in Jackpot. So overall, just implementing some new great characters. His relationship with Harry Osborn is kind of back at the forefront of this arc as well. So again, there's a good mix of like calling back to older eras, while also implementing a lot of new changes. But again, it's very slice of life. Having the Parker luck, we get to see a lot of personal conflict and problems that Peter Parker is having, along with all the conflicts that Spider-Man is having, now being a public menace and effectively outlawed. So again, it's from two fronts, lots of rich conflict, and I think that Dan Slott navigates that so well in a way that's so accessible to new readers. For fans of modern comic books too, this is another great run to just jump into. You can still find these collections fairly cheap, used. I know that they're coming out with a Brand New Day Omnibus, I believe next year. They've solicited that. So that'll be exciting. Hopefully that comes out. But overall, great era from what I've read, lots of new norms, and I also really like the art in this collection. I think it's a little more gritty and realistic compared to like the JMS or even the Ultimate Spider-Man era, which while I love the art styles there, this is just going for something different. This is a little more grounded and real, which again match some of the tonal stuff they're doing, so I just really love that. There's also a lot of rich detail. There's a good amount of kind of cheeky Spider-Man humor while balancing just some really dark and intense themes, and I think that that's just really fun to see. I also think it's one thing to be a hero when everyone's looking and everyone's on your side and you have cheerleaders. It's another thing to be a hero when everything is stacked against you and people are out for blood, so to speak. And I think that this is definitely a volume that embodies that. I love seeing that he's so up against the ropes and still you just see him shine. Also, for fans of the PS4 game, there's a lot of fun tie-ins that you could tell that this was definitely a basis for that storyline. And that is the beginning of Dan Slott's era on The Amazing Spider-Man. one of my picks for a great place to start reading Spider-Man. Next on my list, we have a classic standalone collection in Spider-Man Blue by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. This volume has been notoriously out of print for some time, but I'm hoping with the passing of the beloved Tim Sale that Marvel might do a reprint, because I know there's so many people eager to read this or reread this, and I'd love to see more collections come out. I'm sure you can find it digitally, you can find used copies, things like that, but hopefully we'll see a reprint of some of these collections. So what is Spider-Man Blue? It is a standalone, like 5 or 6 issue little mini-series they had. This essentially is a nostalgia trip that flashes back to a lot of the Silver Age era Spider-Man. It's basically Peter Parker in the presumably present day, whenever that is. He's married to Mary Jane at this time, and it's Valentine's Day, and he's recollecting on the great loss that he had losing Gwen Stacy, the first love of his life. The internal narration is essentially these voice recordings he's leaving as if he's speaking to Gwen Stacy, dearly departed, and each of these little taped sessions he's doing as a form of, like, I don't know, therapy or catharsis. Each of those corresponds to an issue of this miniseries, and it takes place in the past, and we got to see kind of how he fell in love, what those dynamics were like, his friend circle, his villains, and what it was like being a newer hero just deeply in love. And so it's heavily nostalgic, it's very sweet, it's very melancholic, and it's just a triumph. It's a great classic. I think this is a great place to start reading Spider-Man. If you're not a huge fan of the character, or you maybe don't want to invest in like years of the actual runs or continuity, but want a flavor for kind of what this character is, to see some staple characters from his history, to see some superheroics and some of the villains, without, again, maybe diving into everything. Some of the other runs I feel like are great recommendations if you want to read extensively in Spider-Man. This recommendation's more of if you want to read kind of a greatest hits without having to delve into so much. I think this is a great start in an absolutely fantastic standalone collection. And while the writing is certainly moving and moody and intense and just all the flavors of Spider-Man classic goodness by Jeff Loeb there, it's really the artistry in this book that is just spellbinding. Everything kind of has a blue tint. If not everything, it's definitely moody, and you can see it throughout the book. But you get to have almost a kind of cartoony sense of fun. The color palette itself is very vibrant and kind of throws back to the kind of simpler Silver Age kind of aesthetic, with, of course, that Tim Sale style. And I just have to say, it's spectacular to look at. They did a few of these color books from Marvel. Spider-Man Blue I reviewed on the channel some time ago, as well as Daredevil Yellow, which I did more recently. You can see those in my Marvel's Greatest Hits playlist, or you can find them on the channel if you'd like. Overall, like I said, an absolutely enchanting and gripping collection, especially if you're a little sappy like I am. You know, you like the occasional rom-com or romantic tragedy. This is a great read, especially if you're a fan of the characters, or again, if you just want to dabble and read just a great standalone Spider-Man story. I think that this also reveals a great deal about the interior life of some of the characters that are mainstays in the Spider-Man universe, particularly Peter Parker and Mary Jane. Obviously, we're in Peter's head the whole time, and we get to kind of hear him pour his heart and soul out, to the memory of this lost love. But we also have some interactions with Mary Jane in the present that also are really telling about the strength of her character and how deeply she values her husband and also her friend, who Gwen Stacy was as well. And while I do think that this is a great start for new readers, it definitely does pay off more longtime fans who have walked through some of this history, who have gotten to know the character of Gwen and some of these other kind of high school era Spider-Man story characters, independently for years. This is such a great love letter to the history of like classic Spider-Man, that I think it just enriches the work if you've read more of that. But I think if you were just stopping by, there's enough here that you shouldn't feel lost, and it really sets up just a great, kind of like a sad, mourning, but sweet love story. Let me know in the comments below if you've read Spider-Man Blue. Like I said, I think it's a classic. I would love to see them reprint this, or maybe even reprint that long out-of-print Omnibus with all the Marvel Color series that Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale did. But yeah, in the meantime, try to find it if you can. It's a really sweet story. It's only a couple issues, so it's a really low investment for people that just want to check out Spider-Man for the first time. If you do, definitely let me know what you think. Now onward to our last recommendation. Thank you for those sticking with me. The final recommendation for today is the classic Spider-Man Kraven's Last Hunt by DeMatteis and Zek. And I almost included this as an honorable mention before just deciding, you know what, it's worth just recommending straight out. Unlike some of the other recommendations I've had in this video, this is really just recommending a single standalone story that happens just in the middle of the Amazing Spider-Man run. But why I'm recommending it as a place to start reading for the first time Spider-Man is that this is again one of the greatest hits. I think that this is a category more similar to Spider-Man Blue, where it's just a great little standalone one-off story you can be in and out. This is for someone who maybe doesn't want to just engage in huge runs of the character or read a bunch of back history, but just kind of wants to come in and out and read a good story that happens to be Spider-Man. I think this is also a great read if you're trying to hook someone on Spider-Man who maybe sees Spider-Man kind of one-dimensionally. This does a lot of things with the character that you don't really see in some other story arcs. It's a little bit darker, a little bit grittier, and definitely a little bit more adult or deeper. I think that more adult fans of comics as well, or older teens who are trying to think if Spider-Man would be a fun fit for them, this would certainly be something you could point them to as kind of a just upper crust, higher recommendation read. I will say the read could be a little triggering for some. It does deal with mental health and suicide, but if you can kind of get past that, it is a really profound read. And frankly, there's a reason that this is a classic amongst Spider-Man fans. It primarily deals with Kraven the Hunter and also the villainous Vermin. And Spider-Man. This is a time where Spider-Man is wearing that cloth black Spider-Man suit. It's not the symbiote suit, but it is kind of looking like it. And it's just a very specific moment in time. It's also probably my favorite Kraven the Hunter story. We get to see a lot of layers to him, his point of view, his values, and really his overall belief system. It also simultaneously explores some just like darker thoughts that Peter Parker grapples with. He's already in a tough situation himself. So when he gets kind of embroiled in all of this drama and just situations with Kraven the Hunter, it pushes him to the edge. You know, at one point he actually gets buried alive, as you probably saw on the front cover. So it's pretty dark, it's grim, and like I said, it's unlike most Spider-Man stories I've ever read. I think people that are more into psychological thrillers or horror or just heavy character drama, this is a great place for you. If you're kind of just thinking about dabbling in Spider-Man, like I said, this is considered one of the better, more premier story arcs he's ever had. I think that there's a low level of homework you need to do before this. I think if you're even culturally aware of Spider-Man, you can plug right into the story and be fine. It'll fill in any gaps you need, and you can read it as just a standalone collection and enjoy the story for what it is. I think the art is also just super solid. It's heavily detailed, and again, it matches kind of the grittiness of the overall theme and tone of this. There's a lot of just dark, night kind of scenes, shadows, sewers, grungy basements, and just really crude character designs that are detailed, but, you know, just kind of grim. Using the character Vermin as well, you know, he's like a gross rat man. I think that was a perfect addition for a Kraven story, one especially as just intense as this. I think also this is a really fun read, not only for beginners and longtime fans, but people that have a better perspective on the breadth of Spider-Man titles. If you're newer to this, even just watching this video, you've seen so many different eras of Spider-Man, so many different art styles, and I hope I've conveyed just how broad this character has just been adapted, you know, across its 60-something year history. And I certainly think that this really just adds more to the nuance of this character. The fact that he can go to places like this, the fact that stories like this can be told about this character. The same fun-loving, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man who's kind of, oh, gee, darn on my luck, can also be like buried alive in a grim kind of like psychological thriller of a story. That to me is just so impressive and so unique, and I love seeing a character that can explore depths and delve into more just psychological underpinnings of some of these characters that have been around for decades. This also can feel a little bit of an older story. It's, you know, right on the bridge of what I would consider maybe a modern story, maybe just shy of it. So fans that only read really more modern titles or titles, you know, 2000s onward, I have to say this one is really worth going back for. And like I said, low barrier to entry, and the fact that you can just read a few issues and get a great standalone story without having to do a ton of homework or reading on from here, I think it's a great just one-stop shop for new readers or prospective readers. This is another one that goes in and out of print, and I know it has an Epic collection too, so you might still be able to find it around. If you do, drop a comment and let me know what you think. And wow, I can't believe it, but I think that this concludes my list of recommendations. I'm so happy. Thank you so much for watching. Regardless of where you decide to start reading Spider-Man, I sincerely just hope that you do. He has spanned over 60 years of incredible history. There's so many distinct eras and flavors of Spider-Man with so many different creative teams that there really is a little something for everyone. There really is a reason for the popularity and the love that this character has. I really hope that you've enjoyed this recommendation video. Like I said, I've done quite a few of these in unboxings or different reviews throughout the last year or so on my channel. I'll try to link what's pertinent throughout the video. If there's anything you like that you want me to delve deeper into, or maybe something I haven't reviewed that you saw in this video, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you would add to this list, or just generally what your thoughts are. And did you like this kind of video? I haven't done a ton of these. I did a Where to Read Daredevil, so let me know what you think. But thank you so much for sticking around, and I hope I helped you find a good place to start reading Spider-Man. This has been the Comic Book Report. Thank you so much for stopping by. Don't forget to leave a like and check out some of my other videos. Until next time, have a good one.